The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground, as Colonel Marcus Thornfield strutted between the rows of exhausted recruits. His polished boots clicked against the concrete with each deliberate step, creating a rhythm that made the young soldiers' hearts race with anxiety. Thornfield had earned his reputation as the harshest trainer in the entire base, a man who believed that breaking spirits was the fastest path to building warriors. Among the recruits stood Private Daniel Torres, a thin young man whose uniform hung loosely on his small frame. Daniel had joined the army, not out of any desire for glory or combat, but out of desperate necessity. His family's farm had failed, and military service offered the only steady income he could find. At 19, he looked even younger, with kind eyes that seemed out of place in the harsh environment of basic training. For weeks, Daniel had struggled to keep up with the physical demands of military life. His body, weakened by years of poor nutrition during his family's financial struggles, simply couldn't match the strength and endurance of his fellow recruits. Despite working harder than anyone else, staying up late to practice drills and exercise routines, he consistently finished last in every activity. Colonel Thornfield had noticed Daniel's struggles, but instead of offering guidance or encouragement, he had made the young recruit his primary target for humiliation. The colonel believed that singling out the weakest link would motivate others to push themselves harder, never considering the psychological damage his methods might cause. On this particular morning, the recruits were running through combat drills when Daniel stumbled during a particularly complex maneuver. His rifle slipped from his sweaty hands, clattering to the ground as he fell to one knee. The other recruits continued their exercises, but their eyes darted nervously toward Daniel, knowing what was coming next. Thornfield's face darkened with anger as he marched over to where Daniel was struggling to get back on his feet. The colonel's voice boomed across the training ground, causing birds to scatter from nearby trees. "Torres, what kind of pathetic excuse for a soldier are you?" Daniel stood quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment and exhaustion. He had been up since 4 in the morning, trying to improve his physical conditioning before the official training began. His legs shook slightly as he attempted to stand at attention. "Sir, I apologize. I'll do better, sir." The colonel's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to Daniel, close enough that the young recruit could smell the coffee on his superior's breath. "You'll do better? You've been saying that for weeks, Torres, and yet you continue to be a disgrace to this uniform and an embarrassment to every real soldier who has ever worn it." Other recruits had stopped their exercises now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed relieved that they weren't the focus of Thornfield's anger. The training ground fell silent, except for the distant sound of machinery from other parts of the base. Daniel's hands trembled as he tried to maintain his military bearing. "Sir, I'm trying my hardest. I know I'm not the strongest, but I'm committed to improving and serving my country." Thornfield laughed, a cold sound that made several recruits wince. "Serving your country? You can barely serve yourself breakfast without falling over. Look at you, Torres. You're weak, pathetic, and frankly, I'm beginning to wonder if you're even fit to clean the bathrooms, let alone fight alongside real soldiers." The words hit Daniel like physical blows, but he remained standing, his jaw clenched tightly. He thought about his younger sister back home, who was counting on his military salary to help pay for her medical treatments. He thought about his parents, who had sacrificed so much and were so proud when he had enlisted. He couldn't give up, no matter how much Thornfield's words hurt. "I understand your concerns, sir," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "But I won't quit. I'll keep working until I meet the standards expected of me." This response seemed to infuriate Thornfield even more. The colonel had expected Daniel to break, to cry, or to storm off in anger. Instead, the young recruit's quiet determination and refusal to be completely crushed seemed to challenge everything Thornfield believed about effective leadership and motivation. Without warning, Thornfield raised his hand and delivered a sharp slap across Daniel's face. The sound echoed across the training ground like a gunshot, and Daniel's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A red mark immediately appeared on his cheek, and a thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, where his lip had been cut against his teeth. The other recruits gasped in shock. While they had witnessed plenty of harsh treatment during their training, This level of physical violence crossed a line that even the most hardened among them recognized as wrong. Several took involuntary steps backward, as if afraid they might be next. Daniel slowly turned his face back toward Thornfield, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. His eyes, which had always seemed kind and gentle, now held something different. Not anger, not hatred, but a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. He looked directly into Thornfield's eyes and spoke in a voice that, while still respectful, carried an undertone that made the colonel suddenly uncomfortable. "Sir, I believe there are regulations against striking enlisted personnel without cause. I've done nothing to deserve physical punishment beyond struggling with the training that I'm here to learn." Thornfield felt a flicker of unease at Daniel's response, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down in front of the other recruits. "Don't you dare quote regulations to me, Torres. I've been in this army longer than you've been alive. If you can't handle real military discipline, then you have no business wearing that uniform." Daniel nodded slowly, his hand moving to touch the growing bruise on his face. "I can handle discipline, sir. I can handle hard training, long hours, and physical challenges. What I'm having difficulty understanding is how striking a subordinate who has committed no offense serves the interests of military discipline or the army as a whole." The colonel's face reddened with rage at what he perceived as insubordination, but before he could respond, a voice called out from across the training ground. "Colonel Thornfield." Everyone turned to see Sergeant Major Patricia Hayes striding toward them, her expression serious and her pace urgent. Hayes was a highly respected non-commissioned officer with over 20 years of service, and even Thornfield knew better than to dismiss her when she spoke with such authority. As Hayes approached, her experienced eyes quickly took in the scene. Daniel's bruised face, the blood on his lip, the tense postures of the surrounding recruits, and Thornfield's defensive stance. She had seen enough situations like this to understand exactly what had happened. "Colonel, you're needed immediately at the command center. There's been a development that requires your immediate attention," Hayes said, her voice professional but carrying an undercurrent that suggested this wasn't a request. Thornfield glared at Daniel one more time before turning to address the sergeant major. "This better be important." "Hayes." "I was in the middle of correcting a deficient recruit." Hayes glanced at Daniel, noting the young man's straight posture despite his obvious pain, and then back at Thornfield. "Sir, I assure you this matter requires immediate attention. Perhaps we should discuss it privately." As Thornfield stalked away, muttering under his breath about insubordinate recruits and interruptions, Hayes lingered for a moment. She approached Daniel, speaking in a voice low enough that only he could hear. "Torres, report to the medical station and have that lip looked at. Then report to my office at 1400 hours. We need to have a conversation." Daniel nodded, understanding that his situation had just become far more complicated. As the other recruits slowly returned to their training exercises, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation with Thornfield was far from over. What he didn't know was that Sergeant Major Hayes had been quietly observing Thornfield's training methods for weeks, and what she had just witnessed was the final piece of evidence she needed to take action. The young recruit made his way toward the medical station, unaware that his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had impressed not just Hayes, but several of his fellow recruits who had witnessed the encounter. Something had changed in that moment when Thornfield's hand had struck his face. Daniel Torres was no longer just the weak recruit everyone pitied. He had become something else entirely, though neither he nor anyone else yet understood exactly what that meant. 3 hours later, Daniel sat in the small medical station while Corpsman Jennifer Walsh cleaned the cut on his lip. The antiseptic stung, but Daniel barely flinched. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened and what it might mean for his future in the army. "This is going to heal fine," Walsh said, applying a small bandage. "But Daniel, I have to ask, how did this happen? This looks like someone hit you." Daniel hesitated. Military culture had taught him that reporting problems up the chain of command, especially about superior officers, could make life much more difficult. Training accident, Corpsman. Just part of learning. Walsh's expression suggested she didn't believe him, but she didn't press further. As a medical professional, She had seen enough suspicious injuries to recognize them. But she also understood the complex dynamics that often prevented soldiers from speaking openly about abuse. After leaving the medical station, Daniel had 2 hours before his meeting with Sergeant Major Hayes. He decided to spend the time in the base library, a quiet place where he could think without interruption. The library was nearly empty, with only a few soldiers studying for advancement exams or reading letters from home. Daniel chose a corner table and pulled out a notebook where he had been keeping a journal of his military experience. Writing had always helped him process difficult situations, and today's events certainly qualified. As he wrote, he tried to understand why Thornfield's slap had affected him so differently than the verbal abuse he had endured for weeks. The physical blow had been humiliating, yes, but it had also clarified something important. All of Thornfield's previous attacks had focused on Daniel's perceived weaknesses, his physical limitations, his struggle with certain training requirements, his quiet demeanor. But the slap had been pure bullying, an abuse of power that had nothing to do with military training or improvement. For the first time since arriving at basic training, Daniel felt angry, not at himself for being weak, not at the army for being demanding, but at Thornfield for using his authority to hurt someone who was genuinely trying to succeed. This anger was different from anything Daniel had experienced before. It was clean, focused, and strangely empowering. As he wrote, Daniel became aware of someone approaching his table. He looked up to see Private First Class Maria Santos, one of the few recruits who had occasionally shown him kindness during training. Maria was known for her exceptional military knowledge and her ability to excel in every aspect of their training program. "Mind if I sit?" Maria asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from Daniel. Daniel nodded, closing his notebook. Maria sat down and studied his face, noting the fresh bandage and the bruising that was beginning to show around his jaw. "I saw what happened this morning," she said quietly. "That was completely out of line, even for Thornfield." Daniel shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "It's fine, I can handle it." Maria leaned forward, her expression serious. "Daniel, can I tell you something? Something I probably shouldn't know?" Curious despite himself, Daniel nodded. "My father is a career military man, been in the army for 30 years. When I told him I was coming here for basic training, he warned me about Thornfield. Apparently, the colonel has a reputation throughout the military community, and not a good one." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. What kind of reputation? 3 years ago, at another base, one of his recruits had a complete psychological breakdown during training. The kid ended up hospitalized for severe anxiety and depression. There was an investigation, but nothing came of it officially. Thornfield got transferred here instead of facing any real consequences. Maria paused, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "My father also told me that Thornfield's methods are actually counterproductive. Real military leaders don't lead through fear and humiliation. They build soldiers up, they don't tear them down." This information hit Daniel like a revelation. He had assumed that Thornfield's harsh treatment was simply the way military training worked, that his own sensitivity was the problem. Learning that other soldiers and officers disapproved of such methods changed his entire perspective. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. Maria smiled sadly. "Because I've watched you for weeks, and I've seen something that Thornfield completely missed. You never give up. You get knocked down, literally and figuratively, and you keep getting back up. That's not weakness, Daniel. That's the kind of inner strength that makes great soldiers." Before Daniel could respond, Maria stood up. "I have to get to my next training session. But I wanted you to know that some of us have noticed what you're really made of. Don't let Thornfield convince you otherwise." As Maria walked away, Daniel sat in stunned silence. For weeks, he had believed that his fellow recruits saw him only as the weakest link, the one holding everyone back. The idea that some of them actually respected his perseverance was almost overwhelming. At exactly 1,400 hours, Daniel knocked on the door of Sergeant Major Hayes' office. Her voice called for him to enter, and he stepped into a small, efficiently organized space lined with military manuals, commendation certificates, and photographs from Hayes' long career. Hayes gestured for Daniel to sit in the chair across from her desk. She studied him for a moment, taking in his bandaged lip and the determination in his posture despite everything he had endured. Torres, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you can handle it, Hayes began. I've been observing the training methods used with your group, and I have serious concerns about Colonel Thornfield's approach. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. This conversation was heading in a direction he hadn't expected. Sir, I don't want to cause any trouble for the Colonel. I know I'm not the strongest recruit, and maybe I do need tougher treatment to improve. Hayes held up a hand to stop him. Torres, let me tell you something about real military leadership. A good leader identifies each soldier's strengths and helps them develop those strengths while working on their areas for improvement. A good leader doesn't humiliate soldiers in front of their peers, and they certainly don't resort to physical violence against subordinates. She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I've been in the Army for over 20 years, Torres. I've served in combat zones. I've trained thousands of recruits, and I've worked under commanders who were demanding, tough, and effective without ever once raising their hand against a soldier under their command. Daniel absorbed this information, feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. Sergeant Major, what should I do? I don't want to make an official complaint, but I also can't continue to be a target for this kind of treatment. Hayes nodded approvingly. That's a mature way to look at the situation. Let me ask you something. Are you committed to completing your training and serving in the Army? Absolutely, Sergeant Major. My family is counting on me, and despite everything that's happened, I believe I can be a good soldier. I believe that too, Torres. In fact, I think you have qualities that many of your fellow recruits lack. Your persistence, your ability to maintain respect even when you're being disrespected, and your genuine desire to improve. Those are the foundations of real military character. Hayes stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder. I'm going to make some changes to your training schedule. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working with Sergeant Rodriguez, in addition to your regular training. Rodriguez specializes in helping soldiers overcome physical challenges and build confidence. She handed Daniel a paper with his new schedule. I'm also documenting today's incident involving Colonel Thornfield. You're not in trouble, but there needs to be an official record of what happened. Daniel felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. For the first time since arriving at basic training, someone in authority was treating him with respect and offering genuine help instead of criticism. Sergeant Major, there's something else I should probably tell you, Daniel said hesitantly. This morning wasn't the first time Colonel Thornfield has singled me out for harsh treatment. It's been going on for weeks. Hayes's expression hardened. I suspected as much. Torres, I want you to understand something. What you've endured is not normal, and it's not acceptable. You're not weak for struggling with it, and you're not wrong to want it to stop. As Daniel prepared to leave, Hayes called out to him one more time. Torres, I have a feeling that you're going to surprise a lot of people before this training is over. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong here. Walking back to the barracks, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. For the first time since arriving at basic training, he wasn't walking alone in his struggle, but he also knew that his confrontation with Thornfield was far from over, and the colonel wouldn't appreciate having his authority questioned by a sergeant major. That evening, as Daniel lay in his bunk reviewing the day's events, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had no way of knowing just how dramatically his life was about to transform, or that the quiet strength he had shown that morning would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would change everything. As the recruits assembled for their usual morning formation, a black sedan pulled up to the training area. Two men in dress uniforms stepped out, their bearing and insignia immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with military hierarchy. One was a brigadier general, the other a colonel from the inspector general's office. Colonel Thornfield, who had been preparing to address the recruits, suddenly found himself walking toward the sedan with obvious nervousness. The watching recruits could see him straightening his uniform and attempting to compose himself as he approached the senior officers. Daniel stood in formation with his fellow recruits, the bandage on his lip still visible but his posture straight and confident. The previous day's conversation with Sergeant Major Hayes had given him a new perspective on his situation, and the beginning of his work with Sergeant Rodriguez had already started to improve his confidence. Brigadier General Patricia Morrison stepped forward as Thornfield approached. Morrison was a legend in the Army, known for her fairness, her high standards, and her absolute intolerance for abuses of power. She had risen through the ranks during an era when female officers faced significant challenges, and her reputation for identifying and developing talent was unmatched. "Colonel Thornfield," Morrison said, her voice carrying easily across the training area, "I'm here to conduct a routine inspection of your training program. I trust you have no objections to my observing your methods firsthand." Thornfield's face had gone pale, but he managed to respond professionally. "Of course not, General. We're always happy to demonstrate our training procedures for senior leadership." What Thornfield didn't know was that Morrison's visit wasn't routine at all. Sergeant Major Hayes had used proper military channels to report the incident involving Daniel, and Morrison had personally requested to investigate. The general had a particular interest in training abuses, having experienced similar treatment early in her own career. "Excellent," Morrison replied. "Please proceed with your normal training routine. I'll be observing quietly." As the training session began, Thornfield found himself in an impossible situation. His usual methods of intimidation and humiliation would be obviously inappropriate in front of a general. But his entire training philosophy was built around breaking down recruits through harsh treatment. Forced to modify his approach, he became awkward and uncertain, his commands lacking their usual authority. Daniel noticed the change immediately. For the first time in weeks, Thornfield's attention wasn't focused on humiliating him. Instead, the colonel seemed nervous and distracted, constantly glancing toward where General Morrison stood, observing the proceedings. The training session proceeded through various exercises: physical conditioning, weapons handling, tactical movements, and teamwork challenges. As the recruits worked through each activity, Morrison watched carefully, taking notes, and occasionally asking quiet questions of the accompanying colonel from the Inspector General's office. What Morrison observed was revealing. While Thornfield's modified behavior was more professional than usual, she could see the fear and tension in the recruits' faces. Their movements were rigid and nervous, suggesting they were accustomed to harsh criticism for any mistake. Several recruits, particularly Daniel, showed signs of stress that went beyond normal training pressure. After 2 hours of observation, Morrison called for a break and requested to speak privately with several randomly selected recruits. She chose Daniel, Maria Santos, and 3 others, asking them to join her in a nearby conference room. Once the door was closed, Morrison's demeanor became more relaxed and approachable. "Soldiers, I want you to understand that this conversation is confidential, and there will be no negative consequences for honest answers. I'm here because I'm concerned about the training methods being used in your program." She looked at each recruit in turn before continuing. "I've observed some things this morning that concern me, and I've received reports that suggest there may be problems with how you're being treated. I need to know if that's accurate." The recruits exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Finally, Maria Santos spoke up. "General, could you clarify what kind of problems you're referring to?" Morrison smiled approvingly at the careful response. "I'm referring to training methods that go beyond appropriate military discipline. Physical abuse, excessive humiliation, or treatment that seems designed to break rather than build character." Daniel felt his heart racing. This was the moment he had both hoped for and dreaded. A chance to speak truth to someone who might actually be able to make changes. But military culture had trained him to be careful about criticizing superior officers. "General," Daniel said carefully, "I think there have been some instances where the training has been more intense than what I expected based on my understanding of military standards." Morrison noted the diplomatic language but also the obvious nervousness in Daniel's voice. She had conducted enough investigations to recognize when soldiers were afraid to speak openly. "Private Torres, isn't it?" Morrison said, referring to notes she had been given before the visit. "I understand you've had some particular challenges during your training." Daniel nodded, touching the bandage on his lip unconsciously. "Yes, General. I've struggled with some of the physical requirements, And I know that's caused frustration for my instructors. And how have your instructors chosen to address that frustration? The question hung in the air as Daniel wrestled with how to respond. Finally, he made a decision that would change everything. General, yesterday Colonel Thornfield struck me across the face during a training exercise. I had made a mistake, but I don't believe my error warranted physical punishment. Morrison's expression didn't change, but the other colonel quickly made a note. The general nodded, encouragingly. Can you describe the circumstances of this incident? Daniel took a deep breath and provided a detailed, objective account of the previous day's events. He spoke without emotion, simply stating facts and avoiding any interpretation or editorializing. His fellow recruits listened in surprise. None of them had realized just how serious the situation had become. When Daniel finished his account, Morrison asked the other recruits if they had witnessed similar behavior. One by one, they confirmed that they had observed patterns of excessive criticism, public humiliation, and inappropriate treatment of recruits who struggled with training requirements. I want to thank all of you for your honesty, Morrison said after hearing their accounts. Your willingness to speak truthfully, despite the potential risks, demonstrates exactly the kind of integrity the Army needs from its soldiers. She stood up, preparing to leave. You should know that this conversation will remain confidential, and there will be absolutely no retaliation against any of you for speaking honestly. In fact, your courage in addressing these problems will help ensure that future recruits receive the kind of training that builds character rather than breaking it. As the recruits filed out of the conference room, Morrison asked Daniel to remain behind for a moment. Private Torres, I want you to know that I'm impressed by how you've handled this situation. Maintaining your dignity and commitment, despite inappropriate treatment, shows real character. That kind of inner strength is what makes great soldiers. Daniel felt a surge of pride at the general's words, but he was still uncertain about what would happen next. General, what should I expect going forward? I'm still committed to completing my training and serving in the Army. Morrison smiled. I have no doubt that you'll complete your training successfully, Private Torres. In fact, I suspect you're going to exceed everyone's expectations, including your own. 2 hours later, the base erupted in quiet chaos, as word spread through unofficial channels that Colonel Thornfield had been immediately reassigned pending a full investigation. Sergeant Major Hayes would be taking over training responsibilities, assisted by a team of instructors known for their positive but demanding approach to soldier development. That evening, as Daniel sat in the barracks writing in his journal, he reflected on the incredible transformation his life had undergone in just 2 days. The slap that had seemed like the lowest point of his military experience had actually been the catalyst for changes that would benefit not just him, but every future recruit who would train at this facility. Maria Santos approached his bunk, grinning widely. So, Daniel, I heard an interesting rumor. Apparently, General Morrison was so impressed with how you handled that interview today that she specifically requested updates on your progress through training. Daniel looked up in surprise. What does that mean? It means, Maria said, that you've caught the attention of one of the most respected leaders in the Army. I have a feeling your military career is going to be very different from what any of us expected. 3 weeks later, Daniel Torres graduated from basic training in the top third of his class. His physical conditioning had improved dramatically under proper instruction. But more importantly, he had developed a quiet confidence that impressed both his instructors and his fellow soldiers. On graduation day, as Daniel stood in formation wearing his dress uniform, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the audience. General Morrison had come to watch the ceremony, and when she saw him, she nodded approvingly. After the ceremony, Morrison approached Daniel and his family, who had traveled to attend his graduation. Mr. and Mrs. Torres, Morrison said to Daniel's parents, you should be very proud of your son. He demonstrated exactly the kind of character and integrity that our Army needs. She turned to Daniel. Private Torres, I understand you've been assigned to Fort Carson for advanced training. I've taken the liberty of recommending you for a leadership development program. Your ability to maintain your principles under pressure suggests you have potential for significant responsibility in the Army. As Daniel's family celebrated around him, he thought back to that morning when Thornfield's slap had seemed to mark the end of his military dreams. Instead, it had been the beginning of a journey that would take him far beyond anything he had imagined possible. The weak recruit who had once been the target of a bully's abuse had discovered something far more powerful than physical strength. He had found his voice, his courage, and his destiny. Colonel Thornfield, meanwhile, found himself facing a very different future. One that began with him on his knees in a courtroom, pleading for leniency from a military justice system that took a very dim view of officers who abused their power. The slap that was meant to break Daniel Torres had instead broken the career of the man who delivered it, while launching Daniel toward a future bright with possibility.